So sludge, or sometimes they call it biosolids, is the waste sometimes left over from water treatment plants. And if the chemicals are in the water, then they end up in a higher concentration in the sludge. And it's always seemed odd to me that a lot of these water treatment plants actually sell or provide their sludge as they talk about it as basically a form of fertilizer, and it has been widely spread over fields.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. You just heard from Sharon Lerner, an investigative reporter and environmental journalist with ProPublica. She's best known for her in-depth work exposing the persistent and pervasive existence of PFAS chemicals, which is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, otherwise known as PFAS or forever chemicals. You may have heard of PFAS before, as they've been around since Teflon was invented back in 1938. But today, Sharon will tell Dave more about their ties to food and farming, as well as what led to PFAS being present in all of our blood today.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm talking today with Sharon Lerner, who is an investigative reporter at ProPublica since 2022, and before that at the Intercept. Sharon, you've done amazing work.
Thank you.
Your work has shown up in many venues. I probably first found out about you reading the long article on PFAS in the New Yorker, which was excellent.
Thank you.
So, yeah, welcome. Can I ask how you came to be an environmental journalist?
Well, I've been a journalist for a long time, more than 25 years. And I guess for the past 10, 15, I've been writing about environmental issues. And I think my first environmental story was a very complicated one about a cancer cluster in Florida and how it was connected to a defense contractor nearby and pollution from that contractor. And it was really a kind of thorny story that took me about a year to write. And it was a story that nobody else wanted to report on because it was just too complicated. And there was something that clicked for me doing it. And I thought, this is extremely difficult and complicated and really important, and I kind of love it, and I want to do more of it. So that was kind of put me on that path.
Yeah, you. I think it was Ken Cook who said you seem to get people to talk about things that they don't easily talk about with other people. So your writing has a lot of, human drama to it, talking about these big things that are going on. I came to you, I know you did a lot during COVID, and you were looking at the roots of COVID, the government response to it. And I first learned about you through the PFAS story. How many years were you writing on PFAS before you came to Chris Hansen?
My first story on PFAS was in 2015. It was actually a 3-part series that looked at DuPont's role in using PFOA, which is a PFAS chemical, in West Virginia and the contamination near there. And it was it included the story of Rob Bilott, the attorney who was later featured in the film Dark Waters, or not featured, but was kind of based on his story. And so that was the beginning of it. And I did that at the Intercept And I was at the Intercept, as you mentioned, till for 2022, which was 7 years. And during that time, I think I wrote about 60 stories about PFAS chemicals, some of them extremely long and complicated, some of them quick, but I was following those chemicals while I was doing other things as well at the Intercept. But I did stay on that story. And it took, when at the Intercept, I reported about firefighting foam, and that, we were the first place to report that PFAS were in firefighting foam, and that they were a big source of contamination, which later ended up, is still a very huge issue. There's a lot of PFAS contamination on military bases where firefighting foam was used. And that basically the foam seeped in, had contained PFAS that seeped into the soil and into the water systems and into drinking water ultimately.
So I think the acronyms are very confusing to a lot of people. So PFAS is a term for a whole family of chemicals?
Yes, there are thousands of PFAS chemicals, and most people call them PFAS.
Yeah.
Very confusingly, two of the main, but best known chemicals in that class are PFOS, which is sometimes called PFOS, and then PFOA. But honestly, there are thousands of them, and we don't they don't all have names at this point. But what they have in common is that they're fluorinated compounds, which means that they're basically chains of carbons, and the carbons are attached to fluorine atoms. And because the carbon-fluorine bond is extremely strong, they're really persistent. It's very hard to destroy these things. And that's why they're sometimes called forever chemicals, because they last and last, and they persist in the environment. So they can be destroyed by being burnt at very, very, very high temperatures, but these aren't, those conditions wouldn't occur naturally. So in nature, they basically persist forever and are expected to be on the planet long after we are gone from it. So that's why they're called forever chemicals.
And just to be clear, they never existed before they were created in a laboratory.
Exactly. Yeah, these are these man-made compounds, and it was really hard to make them. Took a lot of chemical know-how, chemists figuring out how to get fluorine bonded to carbon. Fluorine is a very reactive molecule, and it's really dangerous to work with. So it took a lot of doing to get these compounds made in the first place.
So we were very clever.
Yeah.
We were very clever. And are PFAS as a class of chemicals dangerous?
Yes. So these compounds, they're very, as I mentioned, persistent, and they're very useful in industry. So they end up, they're resistant to temperatures, right? Because they don't burn until they're really, really high temperature. And they're resistant to water and grease, which means that they're really great for food packaging and for lining things like pans, paper coatings, fabric coatings, right? So they're really useful, but it turns out that they're also toxic. And because there's so many in the class, we don't actually know how each one behaves in the human body, but we know about a few of them, or more than a few, but a minority of them have been studied. But when they're studied, we actually see one, that they accumulate in the human body. So you don't just eat them or come in contact with them and immediately excrete them. They build up. So that's called bioaccumulative. That's one of the things that they do. And the other thing is that they cause harm to various bodily systems. And again, it kind of depends which individual compound you're talking about, but sometimes a lot of different outcomes. They impact the immune system. Some of them cause cancer, various cancers, and reproductive outcomes. All they seem to affect lots of bodily systems. So very dangerous. And yet we all, because they're so widespread, pretty much everyone has some level of these compounds in their blood, in their bodies all the time.
I'm sure, depending on your lifestyle and what you do for a living and all of that, where you live, there are differences in the blood level. But it was amazing to me, the Chris Hansen story. That's kind of how Chris got drawn into that story at 3M. Maybe why don't we talk about Chris? That she was testing blood, right?
So Chris Hansen was a chemist at 3M. She was working there in the late 1990s. She actually stayed at 3M for a long time, but not in the environmental lab, which was where she was working in the 1990s. And she's the person I wrote about in the New Yorker story you mentioned. And so how did she get drawn into this work? She was asked, and she was pretty new at the company at the time. She was young, in her 20s, and she was a chemist who had expertise in studying trace levels of chemicals. And she was asked if she could take a look at blood, human blood, that had been tested by an outside lab that 3M had hired. And they said that there was some contamination in the blood, and could she figure out what it was? So she knew, because they told her, that they had long been monitoring their own workers, 3M, because they were working with fluorochemicals, what they called PFAS at the time, and they knew that the compounds got into the workers' bodies. And they presented this to her as not a health issue, nothing to worry about, but like, this chemical is in the worker's blood. And, we gave it to this outside lab to see if they could figure out what's going on with our monitoring results. And the lab is saying that when they compare the worker's blood to blood from the general public, that they're actually finding the compounds, the fluorinated compounds, not just in the worker's blood, but also in the blood of the general public. There seems to be something wrong. Can you explain? Can you figure it out? So she gets to work and starts analyzing these samples of blood that come from blood banks. So these are from people who should not presumably have this chemical in their blood. But every time she tests the blood, she finds trace levels of the chemical in human blood that isn't from workers. And she does it a few times, and then to the point where she's satisfied it's not a fluke. And she tells her boss, and that set off a very complicated, years-long journey for her of essentially figuring out that that this compound was, in fact, in the blood of pretty much everyone. And she didn't realize at the time that it was toxic, but she knew on some level that it was a problem. And then the challenge became how to get this information to the right people and get the company to do something about it.
Yeah. Did 3M know that this chemical was actually dangerous? At what point did they learn that?
Well, it depends what you mean by 3M. So did 3M know? Yes. So it turns out, and this is a big kind of turning point in the story, that she, after, a very long time of working on this and convincing herself, becoming convinced herself that this chemical was in fact in everybody, and raising the issue to her boss and her superiors and saying, our chemical is in everybody, after, and getting a lot of pushback for saying this. After that, she learns, after a considerable amount of time has passed, when she's in this position of trying to alert people and having them say, you're being alarmist and you're probably wrong, and, check your numbers. And, she finds out that another chemist at 3M had discovered the same thing decades earlier.
Yeah. How does it happen that everybody has PFAS in their blood?
Well, it turns out that it was used in many products. In the beginning, 3M used it in a product called Scotchgard, which is sprayed on furniture, but it was also on clothing to make it waterproof and stain-proof, and on carpets, and then a similar compound on food packaging. And it turns out that there are a lot of sources of exposure, and when you have like a sprayed carpet, or a treated fabric or a paper, not all of the chemical remains on the paper or the fabric. Some of it just basically falls off, comes off, goes into the air, goes onto your carpet, goes into the dust, goes into your mouth, goes into your skin, goes into your body. And as I mentioned, it bioaccumulates, and once it's there, it stays there, and for a certain amount of time. Depends on the compound how long it stays in your body. But if you're continually exposed, because it's one of these things that is in so many products, then even though your body is going to get rid of some of it, if more is coming in, you basically have a constant level.
What about if I were a Chinese peasant? Would I have no PFAS in my blood? Because it's not
So
by cars and smartphones.
Well, in fact, interesting question, because ultimately, Chris is going on this journey of learning more and more about this, becoming more alarmed, telling her superiors, getting pushback, even after she realizes that someone else has figured this out before her. And although actually I'm not sure the chronology of that, but one of the things that happens is she decides to look at historical blood samples and see if they have PFAS in them. And she looks back and she does find PFAS in many older blood samples, until finally she finds one that doesn't contain it. And that was actually from, I believe it was rural China, the first one that she found that didn't contain it. And for her, that was some proof that she had been right all along, because people were saying, well, you see PFAS everywhere, you must be making it up, or maybe your equipment is contaminated, or maybe your method is wrong. And what she ultimately was able to do is show, well, no, because this sample, which was taken before we were selling our products, did not contain it, and that's why I know I'm right.
Yeah. I'm still wrapping my head around it. Of course, terrible for her to be in a situation in which everybody that she works with, which is a large corporation, that it's a world that it creates, and they're all telling her that she's wrong, maybe that she's crazy, maybe that she's really bad at what she does. It's kind of the definition of gaslighting. Yeah. And so it's very hard to disagree with that. That famous experiment where they show people three lines like this, and one is taller than the other, and you're the 10th in the circle where they're asking which one's taller, and except what you don't know is the other 9 people are all part of the experiment, and so they're all saying the short one is the tallest one, and about 90% of the people agreed that the short one was the tallest one, because they were either ashamed that they saw it wrong, or they just must be crazy, or they just started to see it that way. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty famous experiment. The good news is that they discovered if you could just get, I think 20% of the people to tell the truth, you would go with them. So it shows that being a lone voice in the night actually might lead to sort of this mental liberation. Mm-hmm. Anyway, what was that like for her? Was she feeling like she was crazy, or was she feeling just that she was up against this massive indifference?
I think it was incredibly difficult for her. I think I don't think she felt crazy. I think she felt, it was just very, very stressful. But she did stay at the company for a long time after that period. And I think because it was somewhat traumatic what she went through, she kind of buried what she knew. She took wanted to not feel those terrible feelings that she felt when she was going through it, and she put it out of her mind to the extent that she didn't even acknowledge to herself the enormity of what she knew.
Yeah. Yeah. Until at some point she called you.
Yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah. And she wanted to tell you the story. So that was an amazing inside view. We already knew about the chemical, but we didn't know about the human environment in which that chemical became so widespread.
Right. And well, there was a lot known from documents about what had gone on inside 3M. And I myself had written a story, I don't remember the year, 20, I don't know, 17 or something, or around there, where the headline was 3M knew. And we knew from documents that that there was a scientist who had confirmed that PFOS, which was the chemical that Chris was looking at, was in fact present in the blood of the general public. But we didn't know. So, so my story was at the time 3M knew. But what didn't make sense was like how that, if this guy had known in the 1970s about this, how had they kept the secret? And why did it come out when it did? And who knew what and who didn't know? And, what had gone on inside the company? And I only knew, and others who were trying to look at this only knew what was in the documents that had been released through the courts. And so, if you stop to think about it, like, it doesn't really make sense that this guy knew in the 1970s and then it all just got shut up again and nothing happened. It turned out that 3M ended up withdrawing its chemical from the market. It stopped making it, or it announced it was going to stop making in 2000, and it really stopped in 2002. So what's going on in those years between, And that was what Chris helped me explain.
Yeah. So they stopped making PFOS?
Yes. So what they did was they retired PFOS. They announced it 2000, stopped making it, and introduced a replacement in 2002, which is called PFBS. Again, same class, one of the thousands of PFAS compounds. And it turns out that PFBS, which remains in the body for a shorter period of time, also causes many of the same health problems that PFOS does.
So there's a bit of whack-a-mole here. That, and I think it's interesting. There's a bit of a popular movement now to end glyphosate, which is a good idea. It's a carcinogen. I know people who've gotten cancer from it. But is it noticeably worse than dicamba or whatever it is they're going to replace it with next? And it seems that it is important to understand these chemicals that we learn the names of, but it's also important to understand that unless we change the system, it's not going to change the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after the story came out, did things change at all at 3M, for example?
My story?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Not that I know of. I mean, they were already in some pretty serious litigation over their these chemicals. They have been sued by towns and water systems and individuals, and thousands of lawsuits, and those are still underway. I mean, I know that after my story came out, some of the people in my story were deposed by the attorneys, some of the attorneys that are suing 3M, and I think their stories are now being added in some way to some of the litigation and perhaps strengthening it. I don't know, but they have announced, 3M, that they're going to get out of the business of making PFAS and using PFAS by this year. That was their intention. And they had already announced that before the story came out. I think it's a very big job. They make thousands of products that contain these chemicals. So, so presumably they're still trying to do that.
And if 3M stops making PFAS, will that be a big corner turned, or are so many other companies also making PFAS that it will just shift it to a new name?
Well, there are many, many companies that make them and use them. Then we have the issue that they're also, they're everywhere now. They're in our water. They're in, I think it's, one of the PFBS is, I think, in the drinking water of, I believe it's 55 million people, and that's just one that I just happened to be looking at recently. But, these are in drinking water across the country, around the world. They're in soil. And as I mentioned, they're really, really hard to get rid of, and they're in people's bodies. So they're in products. They're still being put in products. And, they're in water, and they're in land, they're in soil. They're in fruit and vegetables grown with soil. They're in fish because they're in the bodies of water that they're swimming in. So 3M not making any products with them, or not producing the chemicals anymore, is certainly a step, but it doesn't, do away with the problem or even come near.
Yeah. I heard you in a conversation with Ken Cook, and Ken of the Environmental Working Group, and he was telling a story that they tested, I think it was umbilical fluid, for neurotoxins, and they found 216 perhaps, and which was an astonishing thing, that to think that a forming fetus is being fed over 200 neurotoxins in the blood.
Right. Pre-polluted, right.
Yeah, and he said that each of the tests costs $10,000. So that's over $2 million of testing for one fetus. It's not something that, we can reasonably expect to be able to do, to test for each individual problematic chemical. What do you think are the chances that regulatory agencies will possibly address this in a way that is effective?
Well, I don't think the regulatory agencies need to check all our blood at this point. We can assume, but I think, it's certainly a huge problem, the regulation of chemicals, and that's something I write a lot about, not just in this article. And it's something, obviously, a lot of that falls to the EPA, and a lot of the problem, both in terms of just use chemicals that, like PFAS, and also pesticides, which are regulated by another part of EPA. There's a lot of pressure from the companies that make and sell them not to crack down on them in various ways. And that is a problem that has been with the agency for a really long time. And it's one that I think we'll see in this current administration as well. The David Fatuhi, the man who is the number 2 to Lee Zeldin at the agency, or will be, he's Donald Trump's nominee, and he just had a hearing the other day, confirmation hearing. He hasn't been confirmed yet, but he has represented companies in defended them against PFAS contamination in suits over PFAS contamination. He also recently tried to overturn the EPA's ban on asbestos. So I think that we're going to see these issues crop up a lot in the next 4 years.
Yeah. Okay. It's not getting better. It's probably getting worse. It wasn't good to begin with. No, I'm just curious. I want to go back to PFAS a little bit later about in the soil, but I'm just curious, as somebody who has worked so intimately and from the heart on these issues, as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, trying to call out malfeasance when it exists. What would be your hope? What would be your hope for, if we could do this, this could get better?
Well, I mean, I think that if we could let the regulators regulate, if we could strip the pressure from the EPA, or at least make sure the EPA could stand up to pressure and do the job it's supposed to do, that would be great. I think it would be wonderful if we could make sure that chemicals were safe before they were introduced to the market, which is, part of the problem here. I mean, certainly when these guys were introduced in, the 40s and the 50s, the PFAS compounds, there was no EPA, there was no requirement to produce data and before they submitted them. But of course, there still actually isn't a requirement for companies to provide data when they submit new chemicals. And I can tell you that, having reported on it, that the process of approving new chemicals is one of the it is done by the EPA, and it is a point of real, has been a point of real pressure. The scientists who work in that division are under a lot of pressure not to point out the harms of chemicals. And so that's another part of the problem to potentially address.
Yeah. What year was the EPA formed?
1970.
1970.
Yep.
So before that, basically, it was understood that companies would police themselves.
Well, I mean, that was the year that they brought it all together, into one agency, and it was Richard Nixon, ironically, so the Republican, it used to be more of a bipartisan issue, even though there were corporate interests that, that were attacking the environmentalists who were bringing this issue up. There was real, Republicans got behind it. And, things have changed certainly now, lately.
Yeah. Not that it worked so well under the Democrats either. I mean, I would say the failure is also bipartisan, but so in that earlier time, I'm trying to imagine a time in which it was believed that the corporations would be good citizens and wouldn't knowingly put out harmful chemicals that would persist and accumulate and make people sick. Do you think that was the belief even for some now, or have we lost that innocence? Do people now feel that you cannot trust the corporations? They will always act in self-interest, in a very short-sighted self-interest.
I'm not sure how people think of it. I certainly have seen many instances of companies knowingly, going ahead with making and selling their products when they know there are issues with them. I mean, unfortunately, there are a lot of examples of that. And I guess I'm not sure the extent to which the public kind of assumes that that's the way it'll go. I don't know.
Yeah. I think people feel a little bit so out of control. They feel helpless. They can't do it, right? They can barely pronounce the names of the chemicals.
Right. No, this is beyond individuals. No one could do this, but right. And right. That's why it's really important to have regulatory agencies and a functioning government.
Yeah, absolutely. just for a minute, I want to touch because, as I said, the way I came to this story was there was an organic farmer in Maine who discovered very inadvertently that his cows, her cows, it was a couple, had PFAS in them. The milk had PFAS. The crops had PFAS. The fields had PFAS. And before they had bought the farm long ago, sludge had been spread there, and apparently the sludge had a lot of PFAS. Could you explain why the sludge might have had a lot of PFAS? How does that work?
Yeah, so sludge, or sometimes they call it biosolids, is the waste sometimes left over from water treatment plants, and if the chemicals are in the water, then they end up in a higher concentration in the sludge. And it's always seemed odd to me that a lot of these water treatment plants actually sell or provide their sludge as they talk about it as basically a form of fertilizer, and it has been widely spread over fields. And I did cover that early on, 8 years ago or something like that. And I remember writing about the first case in Maine when they did testing, and yeah, and there it was, and it was kind of tracing it back. I know that in 2000, the EPA did have evidence of this. It was reported to the EPA, and they knew about it, I think, in 2006. So it's been quite a long time, and that first, I know there are fields like in Arkansas, but it's much, it's a much wider spread problem than that. But basically, that's the thing about these persistent chemicals. They're in water, and then they're in sludge, and then they're in the ground, and then they're in the vegetables, and then they're in us because we eat them, and it goes on and on.
Yeah. And once the land is polluted like that, it's polluted forever, essentially.
I don't know of a way that's easy to remedy. I don't know, I've heard a lot of claims that we can get rid of them. I haven't seen any pan out in a real way yet, in a way that would be affordable on a large scale.
Yeah. So as communities discover that they have real problems in their water, in their soil, what can they do?
Well, there are a lot of lawsuits going on, and sort of the question, what can they do? So I've seen a lot of communities get ripped apart by this. Like if you're a farmer, can be really devastating, right? This is your source of income. And there are filters you can put on your drinking water. That's something that can happen. And then, but I've seen a lot of communities organize, come together, try and figure out the source of it, get involved in litigation, and, go through the process of informing people. But it can be really painful for these communities. A lot of people are concerned about the values of their homes, and don't really want it publicized, or it's just very painful. It can really rip apart a community, and I've seen that happen several times.
Yeah. Are there changes you made in your life because of what you've learned?
It's funny. I get asked this a lot, and I mean, I certainly don't. I don't cook on, for what it's worth, I don't cook on nonstick pans. But really, it's, to me, I don't. To me, it sort of seems like the least of it. The change, the thing that I do take to heart is just less stuff, less plastic, as little plastic as possible in terms of single-use things, and and yeah, and certainly when I know, I know that a product contains PFAS, I try not to use it. But the thing is, through this work, I've realized, it, to me, I think the bigger kind of lessons, it's not about protecting my one self. It's, it's so much bigger. And I feel like it has to do more with trying to hold, trying to bring the truth out about what's happened in terms what is happening in terms of chemical regulation for all sorts of chemicals, and then in terms of figuring out who's responsible, and how do we prevent uh, the kinds of things that we've already seen happening from repeating themselves. How do we get companies to be more responsible, more broad, in the future as we move on?
How do we get companies to be more responsible?
I think partly it's telling the truth about how they've been irresponsible, and I think that people care about it. That's people don't like being lied to, and so I think, I don't know. There are so many people who have a different roles in kind of addressing this: the scientists, the activists, um, lawmakers. And I feel like my role is just to try to understand what's happened and make it intelligible. So that's what I feel like I can do, aside from like avoiding plastic.
Yeah. I was interviewed by a woman once about issues at the USDA, at the National Organic Program. And then she came back to me, wanted to follow up. And I said, I didn't like your story. It wasn't honest. You were quoting people, you knew they were lying, and you just quoted them, and they said this, and then you quoted me, and you knew I was telling the truth, and he said this. And I said, that's not journalism to me. And she went, oh, you mean you want an investigative journalism? And exactly. And she said, my parents were investigative journalists, and they got death threats, and I'm not interested. And
Oh,
yeah,
honest.
yeah, she was very honest with me. And I was so disappointed in her, because I have talked to journalists who were investigative journalists, and they told the truth. And if they thought somebody was lying, they said, I think they're lying, but this is what they said. So I'm just curious, do you get, you have undoubtedly caused 3M millions of dollars of financial loss. Do you ever feel threatened because of that?
No, I have not been threatened.
Good.
Yes.
That's great. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, good. You did story. Do I get it right? Was it Proclero? That the persistent herbicide? Uh,
Hmm.
oh, you're not remembering. I'm not remembering. It's one of those things I have trouble pronouncing.
Oh, chlorpyrifos?
Oh, yes, that's it. Proclerifos.
Chlorpyrifos.
Chloropiros. Yeah.
Chlorpyrifos, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I have written a lot about that.
Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. It's a pesticide. It's a and it's a chemical that can harm children's brains. That is the one you're talking about, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been linked to brain damage pretty clearly, and there have been these really kind of wild battles over how to get rid of it. There was a very prolonged effort to ban it in the United States, and after many legal actions and delays, the Obama administration had it teed up to be banned right before the first Trump administration. And when Trump came into office, he reversed that. Um, and it's been, a battle since, even since there were lawsuits over it. So, but the thing that I have written about, one of the things I've written about is um, the links to various brain harms in children, including autism. And I have, in one case, gone to a community in Northern California of agricultural workers that had really big impacts from this chemical. And there's great data in California that tracks both autism rates and pesticide use that has been able to show the overlap and the, that the higher rates of usage are associated with higher rates of autism.
Wow. So autism has risen fairly dramatically in our country in the last 20 years. In your mind, would you suspect that this is at least partly attributed to the ocean of chemicals that we swim through in our lives?
Well, luckily, I don't have to it's not in my mind. It's not about my suspicions. There's evidence pointing to that. I mean, there's a lot that is not understood, but there have been connections drawn with various chemicals. And so Chloropiros is one. It's an organophosphate pesticide. There are others, lithium, car exhaust, different kinds of air pollution associated with it too. So it's not, so there is good evidence. There's a lot that remains to be understood and to be figured out. But I think it's obviously the science of it became very politicized after the vaccine, the misattribution of the linking autism with vaccines.
Uh-huh. So people started to look more deeply at what was causing autism at that point?
Well, I think people got very afraid of dealing with it at all, because it was such a kind of bitter, polarizing scandal.
Yeah. Okay. I get asked a lot. I'm sure you get asked a lot. Well, what can we do? What can we citizens do? And I never have a very great answer. I have some answers, but I'm curious what your answers might be.
Well, right now, I guess I'm right now reporting on what's going on in the EPA, under this new administration, and not just in the EPA. I wrote a story yesterday about bills that were introduced in Congress and the Senate and the House that would make it impossible for the EPA to use any of more than 500 chemical assessments that have been done by a part of the agency called IRIS. And it's just where basically they've assessed more than 500 chemicals, and they have these independent scientists that basically gauge, the connection between these chemicals and various health outcomes, including cancer. And it's independent, nonpartisan science that attempts to quantify the risks. And that is what the EPA uses for many different rules and regulations. They use them for permits. They use them sometimes for cleanup levels at Superfund sites. And if these bills pass, and I was told by kind of political experts that they have a pretty good chance at this point, with the Republicans in control of both the House and the Senate, that it would make it impossible for the EPA to do basic regulation because so many different parts of its work rely on these assessments. So that's a pretty serious thing. And I think it's, if people care about that, I mean, I've already seen people online saying that this is something they're going to call their lawmakers about, and I think that as someone I quoted in the story said, this bill is supported by many chemical companies and trade groups, American Petroleum Institute, there are like dozens of trade groups that support this. And one of the people I interviewed said, they have a moment politically with Republicans in charge and Trump in the White House, but their agenda with most people, it's not popular. People don't want carcinogens in their water. They don't want them in their environment. And I think that's true. So I think that the issue, that's an issue for the public to, the information's out there now. The bills are out there. They do have a chance of passing. And I think if people are concerned about the prospect of the EPA not being able to regulate essentially at all, but do basic regulations, this is a moment when it's very difficult to pay attention to the news for a lot of people. And yet I do think, as much as we all should be taking care of ourselves, this is really not a time to check out. And I think particularly with this kind of thing, where there are a lot of things that are that this administration would like to do that are going to be profoundly unpopular with people who care about protecting themselves from chemicals and from pollution, and care about the environment and care about their health. And I think the best thing we can do right now is stay engaged.
Okay. All right. That's good advice. That's something to do.
It's difficult,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Okay. Before we go, I always say, is there anything else you'd like to say, or something you wish I'd asked that I didn't? Or
no, I don't think so. I appreciate you having me on.
Good. No, thank you so much. This has been great and very important. So I'm glad that we will have this. So thank you, Sharon.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.